People who live in tiny homes, what's it really like to actually live in one? I lived in one for a year. I'm 5 feet 3, about 100 pounds, and I felt cramped. The subtle thing that started to get to me was that everything was in arm's reach. That sounds good, but in reality there's something psychologically annoying about having no clear delineations of space. You don't have a home office, a kitchen, and a living room. You just have one room and you do everything in it, and it made it weirdly difficult to stay focused. As a result, I am single. Marriage and children. In the past, I live on a 55 feet by 6 feet 10 narrowboat. Best is I do not get hassled by loud neighbors. Worst is the winters. Although I have central heating and a solid fuel stove, OT never seems to be warm enough. I think being single helps if you go tiny home. I live in Ireland. Everything is tiny compared to America. I have issues with storage space, and we are all basically living in one another's ears as the kids grow older. There's also a housing crisis, so my eldest can't get a place of his own. Also, he's in college and working part-time. House is like a train station, at times loudly crying. My husband and I are temporarily living in a travel trailer while our house is being rebuilt, and in my experience, the novelty wears off quickly. We're 5 months in and the stir-crazies set in after about 2 weeks. Lol. Anybody wanting to try it out without making the investment should simply move out of their current home and into a room in their current home. In many cases, it's like having a studio apartment. Just stay out of any bedroom mess you have and live completely in the family room. Use a quarter of your kitchen storage and simply go small for a year. If you can fully commit and not use the other spaces and it feels okay, then you can do a tiny home. If you're super hardcore and want to see if you can swing a 200 sqft New York apartment, you can do the same thing but move into a bedroom instead. It was not a tiny home. It was a tiny condo. It was great for living alone and maintaining it. But at the time I was working in the office, where breakfast and lunch was included. And I would go out a lot. So because I didn't have to cook, and I was at home basically for sleeping, it worked great. Then the pandemic came and I got crazy in it. I moved a few months later to an apartment 3 times the size of it by myself. It fucking sucks. We, my wife and 2 kids, tried to go tiny and off-grid in an effort to save money in the current shitshow that is the world. And it almost killed us. I'm not exaggerating. The constant worrying about the solar, limited water, shitty internet, the was one of the most awful experiences of my life. I tried to have myself committed to a mental hospital, it got so bad. I'm not saying some wouldn't enjoy it, but for never again. And for reference, as a teenager my 6-person family lived in a tent for 3 years. And a shack for 2. I don't know how my folks managed. Yup, studio apartments in big cities routinely are under $650 featuring squared. I lived in smaller with no issues. But that's as a single person, with no children or pets. It's not a hardship to live in an apartment that's small. I do know families with a child that have split up their studio to make a private room. It's cramped, but they're okay. But I imagine having to deal with water hookups, electricity and heating makes a standalone tiny home experience very different. I had a friend years back that lived in one. I visited once, and all I can compare it to is living inside a toy version of a house. He had a toy bed, a toy oven. A toy was like being in a playset. Living in downtown Toronto right now, Neil Wychick, for those who know, and my room is 7 wide by 11 long, and a shared kitchen with 3 others. Not a bad time. It's livable, and I know sooner or later I'll be getting something else. I enjoy the proximity to a lot of things downtown, but I really wish I was able to stretch my arms without touching both walls of my room. I currently live in one room. It's a relatively large room with lots of sunlight and a small kitchenette. This leaves me with a lot of disposable income to fuck around with. Plus the size makes space feel cozy. Especially when the sun comes in 10 a.m. 3 p.m. period. I'm single and living in one for the next year or so. I enjoy it because it's the first place I haven't shared with anyone, and it makes it easy to get out into nature because it's only one room, so the outside is right there. If that makes any sense. I don't like having just a little kitchenette though, and it's so fucking cold. I just have a small space heater. I know others have heat though. As a NY native, some of the tiny homes that I see are so much nicer than some of the dumps I've lived in throughout my life. I go stay in my travel trailer fairly often on a lake, and about 3 or 4 days is about all I can stand. For me, standing up with care, walking with care so I don't knock things over or bump into things, and never having much room to lay anything out like a hobby or store many groceries etc. gets old real fast, and that's when it's nice out and I'm outside most of the time. So tiny home living is definitely not for me. Tiny homes are like a masterclass in decluttering. You learn to prioritize what truly matters and let go of the unnecessary stuff. My colleague calls it his tiny prison. Depending on your definition of tiny, our home is 670 square feet. With 2 very small bedrooms. We love it. It's cheap to heat, easy to clean, and very cozy. It has extra high ceilings too, which helps it feel spacious. That said, having guests over quickly makes it feel cramped. And in the deepness of winter the cabin fever is real. Not to mention we have a second child on the way, which means the eldest is eventually gonna have to learn to share. After living in many different places over the years, we feel like a 1,000 square foot house with 3 small bedrooms would be ideal. Our little house will suffice for now though. I lived in a 500 square foot home with 1 bedroom, 1 bath, and a private courtyard in back. I was a single person living with my dog. It was perfect for my 20s. And I always laugh when people brag about how tiny their tiny house is, when it's larger than my house, which I wouldn't consider tiny. I guess it's all about perspective. I live in a 35 square meters apartment, 377 square feet, and it's big enough. It came furnished, and if I had to furnish it myself I think I could make better use of the limited space. But it doesn't really feel cramped as is. My family and I lived in an RV for 2 years while our house was being built. It was horrible, but we saved so much money. I think it would be okay for a couple or single person. But I cannot recommend it for a family. Ugh. I lived in a tiny home with my tiny son at the time. We didn't have running water inside but were very close to facilities. I always tell people there's a reason why there's lots of shows about building tiny homes and less information about living in them. We were always outside and at my mom's. It was mine, and it was better than some of the alternatives. I went from a 1-bedroom to a townhouse to a 1-bedroom to a studio. I prefer studio. It's nice. I can see all angles of entry ex-military. And saving money is absurdly awesome. Plus, I live in NYC, so I have the adults' playground right outside. Luckily my studio is extremely quiet for a NYC studio too. Just be prepared to hit your head and shins against stuff constantly. I'm 5'2" and my head still was not safe when I lived in a bus.